heavily rutted road surfaces, indiscriminate ditches and bumps, completely lawless road users and cutthroat traffic. I'm not talking about the setup to a post-apocalyptic thriller. It's driving in India and you're going to want to equip yourself to the task. Do you choose the newest from Nissan or do you go with something tried and tested? Let's find out.
If it's an urban SUV you're looking for, the Toyota Urban Cruiser and Maruti Suzuki Brezza are the most SUV-like in the segment with a nice square stance and full proportions. Side by side with the Magnite with its sharply raked front and rear windscreens, the Magnite does look a little more hatchbackish. This is confirmed by its dimensions which measure in under the Toyotas, especially in the all-important height department, even though the Magnite's 205mm ground clearance is marginally better. And while the Magnite wears much sharper and eye-catching styling otherwise, there's something a little off about the large wheel arch extensions in profile. The beefier 215/60 R16 wheel tire package on the Urban Cruiser helps it too over the 195/60 section 16 inches of the Magnite.
Now the Magnite does seem engineered for shorter people. For me at about 5'11", it feels like the pedals are placed too far forward, and since the steering isn't adjustable for reach, what happens is that if I'm comfortable like this, the wheel feels just a little far away from me, but if I bring it forward a little bit, my feet start to feel a little cramped. Other than that, space management is pretty good in here. The design is actually quite striking and modern, but there are a few touches that take away from the otherwise premium feel brought about by some of the materials used in here and in the gear lever. Like for example, the headliner and what's happening with the inner rear view mirror and the light controls.
The Urban Cruiser is familiar now, with just brown upholstery to distinguish it from the Brezza. But that does mean it's a functional cabin and gets the job done, and certain plastics and cabin materials do feel like they're worth the extra money over the relatively bargain part feel in certain areas of the Magnite, but just about. The ergonomics also feel better suited to taller drivers, though something as simple as the sun blinds don't really block out the sun, while the Magnites do but require a bit of effort to get into place. And that's as good a place as any to get into the feature set, where unsurprisingly the newer Magnite pulls out a lead with genuinely useful features like wireless charging and phone integration, not to mention the large glove box, though some convenience features are missing which are present on the Urban Cruiser and do help give it a slightly premium feel when it comes to those.
Neither of these cars give rear seat passengers real cause for complaint when it comes to space. The feeling of airiness in the Brezza, however, may be just a little more due to the slightly larger windows, but the seats on the Magnite feel a little more comfortable despite slightly less underside support. What you do get is a more comfortable angle of recline and what feels like more comfortable padding.
We have plenty of experience in the Brezza to draw from, having covered thousands of kilometers in it, and it does get a little uncomfortable in the rear seat over long distances. The two both get dual front airbags, seatbelt pre-tensioners and the basic suite of passive electronic safety aids in ABS, EBD and so on. The two also have been crash tested by different agencies however, and both have got commendable 4-star safety ratings.
Between the 1.5-litre 4-cylinder in the Urban Cruiser and the 1-litre 3-cylinder in the Magnite, choice should be obvious, right? There's no replacement for displacement, except that turbocharger adds a whole other level of performance to the Magnite that you just can't get with the Urban Cruiser. Both on paper and in our testing, the Magnite has the edge in terms of figures, and when it comes down to it, it just feels a lot more sprightly, it just feels a lot more peppy. As far as automatic gearboxes go, this CVT is one of the best that you can buy in this price range. What you may not like as much is some of the vibrations that creep in through the pedal and through the wheel at very low revs, and you feel it when you're just getting off the brakes at a traffic jam, so you do feel it often. The good thing is that it vastly improves as you get going, and even better, the engine doesn't sound too gravelly or too thrummy either. While you can't take control of the CVT gearbox, it's actually really intuitive. If you need an overtake out on the highway, you get a linear build of pace, and that's something that you don't often see with the CVT. The Urban Cruiser's 1.5 litre petrol certainly is adequate for most everything, be it city work or highway work, but paired with the 4-speed torque converter automatic, it just feels like the gearbox is sucking the life out of it. It just doesn't feel as nice as it used to. And you'll notice that in the city, where you'll see the revs shoot up a lot higher than you would expect just to get away from traffic lights and keep ahead of traffic. On the highway, if you put your foot down, the revs shoot up immediately, almost near to a red line to get you to build pace. The good thing is that this engine does feel like it builds pace above a certain point a lot easier than the Magnite's 1 litre turbo. Of course, if you were looking at it practically, that would mean that you're at higher RPMs more of the time in the larger engine car, which doesn't really make sense, but that's the way it happens. Of course, that 4-speed automatic does mean that you're carrying quite high revs out on the highway at a steady 120 kmph or even 100 kmph for that matter, being at about 3000 and about 2500 revs respectively. The fact that you're carrying higher revs in a larger engine car just doesn't sit right with me, but somewhat surprisingly, the fuel efficiency doesn't hurt for it. So I guess all that displacement does matter someplace. Of course, if you are hoping for some sort of manual control with the Urban Cruiser's torque converter automatic, you'd be a little disappointed. You do have a couple of modes for the gearbox, but apart from the L mode really helping out when you're descending steep slopes, there's not much else in there for you. In my opinion, the only thing that's keeping the Magnite's ride quality from being quite like the Kicks, which is to say very good, is the fact that it gets noisy, especially over joints like that. You do hear it, and on a bad road, you're not going to like the sounds that it makes, but you're going to love the comfort that it brings you. It is a little firm, but it irons out those micro vibrations really well. Magnite also drives a little bit like its larger cousin out on the highway, where the steering feels nice and weighted, and there's quite a bit of heft to it, so keeping it in a straight line is very confidence inspiring. The problem is when you're in the city, all that extra weight can actually get tiresome, and at the end of a long tiring day in traffic, when you have to move that wheel to make a 3-point turn, it doesn't feel the best. As a result of that slightly firm suspension setup, the handling of the Magnite can actually be quite pleasing. It's not all out enthusiastic, but it can hold its line through a corner really well. The problem is that sometimes the steering feels a little bit inconsistent, so when you have to second guess what the car is going to do, it does rob you of quite a bit of confidence. If your usage is going to be primarily in the city, you might like the slight extra edge and pliancy that the Urban Cruiser has, but that does mean that it does have a little more micro vibrations, especially over less than perfect road surfaces. You feel it coming up through the steering wheel and through the pedals. Now the thing with the Urban Cruiser's handling is that it does feel familiar. Now we know this car, we know how it reacts, so even though the steering is not the most precise steering out there, we've come to live with it, and we know exactly what it's going to do. I mean, there are times where the slightly pliant setup at the rear makes it step out of line, especially if there are bumps mid-corner, but we know what to do with it. In the Magnite, I think that's going to be quite a bit of a learning process, because the car just keeps changing its language.
In this case, it certainly may seem like it would pay off for you to go with the newest and shiniest compact SUV available, since the difference in what you pay upfront doesn't really feel like too much of a drop in quality. Don't get us mistaken though, you do notice it in a few areas. But for something to take on our city roads and the occasional highway trip, you can't do much better than the Magnite, even a fully loaded one, without spending a good amount of money extra for some of the more refined and better finished Korean rivals. For Nissan's first go at the segment, it's a great car.